Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're looking at the titans, the absolute behemoths of industry. We're talking about those companies that seemed completely invincible, right up until they suddenly weren't. You know, it's fascinating to look back because it turns out no corporate giant is ever truly safe from a catastrophic downfall. One bad choice, one brief moment of arrogance, and poof, an entire empire can literally be erased overnight. So, what actually causes these spectacular downfalls? Well, it usually boils down to just one word: hubris. It's that excessive pride or self-confidence that completely blinds industry leaders to their own impending doom. In this explainer, we're going to explore 10 massive historical failures. We'll look at the exact moments these titans stumbled, really to prove to you why adaptability and, honestly, just a little bit of humility are absolutely required if you want to survive in business.
Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. We've categorized these massive blunders into 5 core areas. First, fixing what isn't broken. Second, laughing at the competition. Third, billion-dollar bad deals. Fourth, losing the tech wars. And finally, the ultimate cost of hubris. Think of this whole thing as a masterclass in exactly what not to do.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, fixing what isn't broken.
We're going to introduce this theme of unnecessary meddling by traveling back to a classic 1976 beer catastrophe. So in '76, Schlitz was America's second largest brewer. They were huge, but their CEO, Robert Weinlein Jr., aggressively pushed a recipe change just to save millions in production costs. Step 1, they swapped out quality malted barley for corn syrup. Step 2, they added these cheap chemical stabilizers to speed up the brewing. And Step 3, they heat pasteurized the bottles to extend the shelf life. The result? Well, regulars in Milwaukee bars started whispering that the beer tasted like soap. It had this weak foam and a really odd metallic aftertaste. Even worse, if you expose those heat-pasteurized bottles to light, the beer turned cloudy and sour. Competitors like Budweiser ruthlessly mocked them in ads, calling them the beer of shortcuts. Because of a recipe change that literally no one asked for, Schlitz completely crashed to 7th place by 1981.
Now, this kind of unnecessary meddling happens on an even bigger scale, too. In a shockingly short window back in April 1985, Coca-Cola CEO Roberto Goizueta and his marketing chief Sergio Zyman arrogantly altered a beloved 99-year-old formula. They launched New Coke, which was this sweeter drink meant to beat Pepsi in the cola wars. But man, did they fundamentally misunderstand their customers. By June, sales were absolutely sinking, amidst massive nationwide protests. People literally hoarded the old formula. Protest groups even formed, officially calling themselves the Old Cola Drinkers of America. Pepsi was actually gloating in their TV commercials. Coca-Cola executives went into total panic mode, and on July 11th, just 79 days after launch, they completely reversed course and brought the original back as Coca-Cola Classic.
Which brings us to our first what-if scenario. Think about this. If Coca-Cola never launched New Coke, we might never have realized how incredibly fast a brand can trigger a national uproar over a childhood taste. It inadvertently proved the deep emotional power and resilience of their original brand. Sometimes, the absolute worst mistake proves exactly what you were doing right in the first place.
Moving right along to Section 2, laughing at the competition.
This is where industry leaders actively and super arrogantly mock the very forces that will eventually destroy them. Get a load of this quote: "Guitar groups are on the way out." That was confidently stated on January 1st, 1962 by Decca Records executive Dick Rowe. You see, 4 young men from Liverpool, John, Paul, George, and Pete Best, had just recorded a 15-song audition for him. Rowe listened politely, rejected them, and signed a band called Brian Poole and the Tremolos instead. He completely missed out on global Beatlemania, which obviously exploded just 2 years later when the Beatles became the biggest band in the entire world. Decca basically became the ultimate textbook case of spectacularly bad judgment.
And that historical arrogance definitely didn't stop in the music industry. Jump forward to September 2000. 2 scrappy founders, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph, walked into Blockbuster's Dallas office with what was essentially a desperate offer: buy their little startup, Netflix, for $50 million. Blockbuster's CEO, John Antioco, literally laughed them out of the room. I mean, at the time, Blockbuster was the absolute ruler of Friday nights. They had 9,000 glowing retail stores. They thought they were totally untouchable. But the cost of that laugh? A staggering $200 billion. That is Netflix's modern valuation. When broadband finally arrived and Netflix shifted to streaming in 2007, customers enthusiastically followed. And Blockbuster? Well, they stubbornly clung to their late fees, crumbled under the pressure, and ultimately declared bankruptcy by 2010. They laughed at a $50 million buyout and missed out on a $200 billion empire.
Let's anchor this with another what if, just to show why this still matters to us today. If Blockbuster had actually bought Netflix for $50 million back then, we might still be wandering physical store aisles on Friday nights, clutching DVDs and constantly stressing out about late fees. Netflix completely revolutionized our present-day streaming reality, simply because Blockbuster was just too arrogant to adapt to the internet.
Okay, that brings us to Section 3, billion-dollar bad deals.
You know, sometimes catastrophic mergers and acquisitions happen because companies profoundly misunderstand exactly what they're buying. Take the sheer, painful scale of the Snapple disaster. Back in November 1994, Quaker Oats CEO William Smithberg proudly bought Snapple for $1.7 billion. He promised everyone it was a perfect fit, thinking he could do for iced tea what Quaker had already done for Gatorade. But Snapple wasn't Gatorade. It was this quirky brand built on small distributors, little corner stores, and oddball ads. Quaker tried forcing Snapple into their rigid, massive supermarket system. Deliveries slowed down, shelves went empty, and meanwhile Coca-Cola and Pepsi happily rolled out their own teas, completely draining Snapple's momentum. By 1997, a desperate Quaker sold Snapple off for just $300 million. They lost $1.4 billion in just 3 years. Wall Street absolutely laughed at them, calling it one of the worst acquisitions in corporate history.
Speaking of terrible financial choices, we have to talk about Yahoo's tragically missed opportunities. In 1998, a couple of Stanford students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin offered to sell their search engine, Google, to Yahoo for a mere $1 million. Yahoo declined. They thought search was just a minor side feature. Then, in 2002, they got a second chance. The asking price was now $3 billion, but Yahoo CEO Terry Semel refused, saying it was just way too high. Yahoo tried building its own tools instead and fell completely behind. Ultimately, Yahoo's own value shrank so much over the years that in 2017, Verizon bought the entirety of Yahoo for just $4.48 billion.
And here is the brutal punchline to that story. $1.5 trillion. That's Google's massive modern valuation. Google's cleaner design and smarter ads made it the undisputed default gateway to human information. Yahoo passed on this absolute juggernaut not once, but twice, all because they just couldn't see where the internet was heading.
Just imagine that alternate reality for a second. If Yahoo had simply paid that $3 billion in 2002, Googling wouldn't even be a verb today. We'd all be searching the web right now by Yahooing. It really puts into perspective the true, jaw-dropping cost of passing up the deal of the century.
All right, on to Section 4, losing the tech wars.
The fast-paced realm of consumer tech teaches us a really harsh lesson. Early dominance and superior hardware specs mean absolutely nothing without market adaptability. Take the legendary format war of the 1970s. In '75, Sony chairman Akio Morita launched Betamax. It offered amazing, movie-quality playback, but the tapes only held 1 hour of footage, and Sony firmly locked down the technology. Then JVC launched VHS a year later in '76. Now, the picture wasn't quite as sharp, but the tapes held 2 to 4 hours, which is enough for a whole movie. Plus, JVC wisely licensed their tech to dozens of other manufacturers. So the crucial point here is that everyday consumers actively chose convenience and multi-brand availability over sheer picture quality. By the mid-1980s, VHS controlled over 70% of the market, leaving Betamax completely frustrated and defeated.
And we see this exact same dynamic play out decades later in mobile phones. 40%. That is a massive slice of the global pie. That represents Nokia's staggering global market share, right before Apple's sleek iPhone and Google's Android launch in 2007. They were the undisputed kings of the mobile world, seemingly invincible.
But that legacy empire collapsed breathtakingly fast. In 2007, Apple drops the iPhone. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer actually laughed at it, calling it overpriced and doomed. By 2010, Nokia CEO Stephen Alop delivers his now famous burning platform speech, finally admitting they're in deep trouble because their Symbian operating system looked incredibly outdated and app developers were fleeing. Alop bet everything on Windows Phone, a massive gamble that completely failed as consumers just ignored their clunky smartphones. By 2013, Microsoft bought Nokia's handset business for $7.2 billion, only to write the entire deal off as a near total loss less than 2 years later.
Consider our final tech what-if for a moment. What if Microsoft's Steve Ballmer and BlackBerry's CEOs, who also totally dominated business communications back then, had actually taken the iPhone seriously in 2007? BlackBerry literally laughed at glass screens, clinging stubbornly to their little plastic keyboards. If they had just embraced touchscreens and adapted quickly, Apple might not totally dominate today, and BBM could honestly still be the world's default texting app. It's a textbook case of sheer arrogance, blinding leaders to massive consumer shifts.
And finally, Section 5, the ultimate cost of hubris.
Let's pull all of this together and synthesize the vital lessons we've learned from these spectacular historical blunders. Here is the core takeaway. Adaptability and humility are the true currencies of business. It really doesn't matter if you have 9,000 retail stores like Blockbuster, a beloved 99-year-old recipe like Coca-Cola, or 40% of the entire global mobile market like Nokia. If you try fixing what isn't broken, or if you fail to respect your competition by literally laughing them out of the room, you will inevitably engineer your own downfall. True survival means constantly evolving, not just resting comfortably on your past successes. So, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. Which giant is making a fatal mistake today? Take a good look at today's corporate landscape. Who is comfortably sitting at the top right now, utterly convinced of their invincibility and laughing at the next big thing? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Keep your eyes open out there.